This is the MOJO, the Meaning of Life and Business podcast, where life and business intersect. Hosted by Jennifer Glass, CEO of Business Growth Strategies International and BGSI Coaching. We are dedicated to your success. Hello and welcome to another episode of MOJO, the Meaning of Life and Business. If you've been listening before, thank you so much. If you are brand new to this show, thank you so much for checking us out. And please consider liking, following, subscribing to our show so that you can be kept up to date on what it is that we are doing on this show. On today's episode, for anyone that has been listening to me for any amount of time, you know that politics is definitely one of my vices. I am eventually going to be president of the United States. My stated goal is by the 2040 elections, I will be running. And so when it comes down to an opportunity to talk politics on this show, you know that I'm going to really revel in that opportunity. I just wish that they didn't give me only so little time because politics can easily go on and on and on. Just remember, here in this country alone, it's already 250 years that we have been in this democratic experiment that our founding forefathers decided they wanted to play. And so before I bring my guest on, and rather than me taking any more time with this introduction, let me tell you about my guest who is really going to help us learn a little bit more about politics, learn a little bit more about the entitlements and other ways that politics is playing into our lives. And maybe we'll see there may be a little bit of political debate as we go through this, the old-fashioned debate, not the new-fashioned debate. But again, we're not going there. But let me introduce you to my guest. Dr. Murray Sabrin is Professor Emeritus of Finance at Ramapo College of New Jersey. He is the author of 6 books on taxes, healthcare, the economy, as well as a memoir. Sabrin was a New Jersey Gubernatorial and a U.S. Senate candidate, and in 1997, he was the first third-party candidate to participate in the debates with the 2 major party candidates. Murray, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be with you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Murray, first of all, let me tell you, being on the stage with the 2 major party candidates is pretty cool. At any given time when you're able to do that. So let me ask you though, when you were in that position as the first third party candidate, and again, we know as an example, we had Ross Perot, who was a third party candidate. He's one of the more famous third party candidates, not belittling your candidacy or anything, but Ross Perot on the presidential stage, that's pretty significant being on there, polling at least 1% in order to get on there. When you were on this stage, what was, first of all, going through your head being the first third-party candidate to be on a stage like this?
Well, let me just say, I never debated anybody, let alone in a political campaign, because it was the first time I ran for political office, and I was recruited by the Libertarian Party. I had no aspirations to run for public office, but they called me one Sunday afternoon and said, "We think you'd be a great candidate to spread the message of the Libertarian Party," which is very simple. It could be found in the Declaration of Independence. The 205th anniversary happened, and it's about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the libertarian creed, if you will, or as they say, the non-aggression principle. You can do anything you want as long as it's peaceful. It doesn't involve force or fraud. And with the issues in New Jersey, I said, let me apply these principles to the issues facing the people of New Jersey, which were property taxes, regulation, and all the other things that government does to stifle creativity and business formation in the state. And although I didn't win, we had an impact on public policy, namely getting rid of the 55-mile speed limit, extending free speech to your own property, and pointing out how ridiculous some of the policies were coming out of Trenton of borrowing money for the pension, for paying for pensions. And this didn't make any sense to me as a finance person. You don't borrow money to fund your retirement account, which is what the state essentially was doing. So we looked at what was going on in the state, and we said, what are the solutions, common sense solutions? I was one of the first people in the country to say medical marijuana should be legal, and my two opponents were opposed to it. Today, I don't think anyone is opposed to medical marijuana in the political arena. Everyone thinks that it's part of the of choice that we have as individuals, and that the doctor-patient relationship would allow us to have medical marijuana. I also called for the criminalization of drugs, because again, these are private choices. These are not criminal issues. Alcoholism is not a crime. Cigarette smoking is not a crime. They're extremely harmful to the average person, and drug abuse is very harmful. So again, it's the whole ethic of, I'm from the government and I know what's best for you, and if you don't do what we say we're going to do, we're going to punish you by either fines or imprisonment. And to me, I reject that concept completely, because in a free society, we should be able to do anything peaceful, even if it may hurt us individually.
So, and I'm going to preface this entire show with a major disclaimer here. Any opinions here, like it or not, these are peaceful conversations. It's not designed to really have anybody come after either one side in terms of any kind of um, distaste, dislike, or anything else in that regard. You're free to certainly comment on anything, but do it in a peaceful manner. So that way we don't devolve into any kind of additional concerns. But Murray, let me ask you, I mean, because you mentioned about the decriminalization of drugs, you mentioned the medical marijuana, and in this country, there's still a few states where medical marijuana, according to my understanding, is still against the law. But putting that issue aside, let me ask, when it comes down to abortion, would abortion be a similar kind of look in that perspective? Obviously, the Supreme Court several years ago came down with its own decision, rolling back on the Roe v. Wade decision. So I'm curious to know, in your perspective, does that fit in the same thing with medical marijuana, with decriminalization of drugs, things along those lines? Where is your perspective on that?
Great question. In 1973, when the Supreme Court ruled that abortion was legal, I was pro-choice at the time, and I said, "This is a terrible decision, because this is not a federal issue. It's certainly not a federal constitutional issue. Historically, it's been left to the states to decide what should be the appropriate abortion policy in each state." And then when in 1995, 2 years before I was the Libertarian Party candidate, one of my students, non-traditional students, for some reason, showed me a picture of partial birth abortion, and I thought that was illegal under the Roe versus Wade decision, where a full formed baby was basically killed uh, inside the womb, or close to outside the womb. And so when the 97 campaign rolled around, partial birth abortion was a big issue. And I said, I'm opposed to it, because it's clearly the taking of a human life, which is, again, anti-freedom, anti-liberty, anti everything that we supposedly stand for in terms of humanity. And so then I called my good friend, former Congressman Ron Paul, who's a Republican libertarian, and he was a gynecologist, obstetrician, and he wrote a book basically giving the libertarian defense for the pro-life position. He sent it to me. I read it, and it convinced me that if we're going to oppose uh, partial birth abortion at 9 months or 8 months, then we should oppose abortion at 7 months, 6 months, 5 months, and so on. There's a logic to that argument. And so I came out in favor of the pro-life position, which, by the way, in the libertarian movement, there are people who are pro-life, there are people who are pro-choice, and there are people who are neutral. So again, it's not a position that is a monolithic within the libertarian movement. So from my perspective, to me, if you're going to call yourself a humanitarian, then you have to protect life in all its forms.
Okay, so does your position include a certain out if certain things exist? I mean, right now in this country, there are states where there is no exception,
Right.
right? In your position and the way that you would, if you were going to be running for office again and you were going to be having your platform, would your platform say abortion is okay in these situations or it's never okay?
This is probably the most difficult decision there is in public policy. What should be the position regarding no abortion at any under any circumstances or exceptions to incest or rape? And Congressman Paul points out in his book that there should be no exception for the simple reason that life is life. You don't punish an innocent party to a victimization that occurred. And so these are very difficult situations. That's why we have pregnancy crisis centers all across the country where they can guide women who are impregnated because of incest or rape, and they can make their own decision. But the states can carve this out very easily. And the problem with the exception, and here's the really key thing, is that it could be a woman can say that she's been sexually abused when she wasn't sexually abused, and therefore she would be entitled to an abortion under these guidelines. So again, it's a very difficult situation. It's not an easy one. And from the data that I've seen, very few abortions are caused by rape and incest. So having said that aside, again, we could leave it up to the woman in most categories whether she would want an abortion or not. But as Congressman Paul points out in his book, there are so many, not so many, but there are people, young infants that are born because of rape or incest that turn out to be incredibly human beings in terms of what they've achieved in life. And so here's an example of we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
All right, so I'm going to follow up that question with two specific situations. One is there was a case last year, I think it was, where a woman down south was brain dead. She was clinically brain dead. Her doctors confirmed she had absolutely no brain activity after, I think it was some accident. And she was the victim of rape or incest. And according to the law, the doctors and the hospital had to keep the mother alive in order to deliver the child because by pulling the plug, if you will, it would have killed the
Mm-hmm.
baby, which caused untold psychological damage to the family,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to her herself being forced to be kept alive simply for purposes of being a womb. In that kind of a situation, again, there is no exception to the law.
Right,
Would
right.
you still agree that if the mother is clinically brain dead, and even by state doctors is confirmed to be clinically brain dead, would that have a similar concern? Or would that be one of those, all right, look, it's not healthy for everyone involved?
Yeah, yeah. This is probably the most difficult case you could possibly have regarding uh, whether to abort the baby or not to abort the baby. And again, if we're a society of the rule of law, then the law says the baby has to be, the woman has to be kept alive in order for the baby to be born. And so that's the law. If people are upset about the law, they should change the law. But again, there are a lot of laws we don't like, tax laws, tariff laws, all sorts of laws, but yet we follow them unless we want to pay the price for ignoring them or disobeying them.
All right, so I'm not going to ask about that second concern with the abortion because I think we'll have a similar answer, but let's move on because, like you said, the
Sure.
tax laws, tariffs laws, things along those lines. As of the day of this recording, the US Supreme Court heard arguments about the tariffs and the presidential power to implement tariffs bypassing Congress. I'm curious to know, Murray, based on where we are, and again, as the day of this recording, the court has not yet ruled on anything related to the tariffs. So I'm curious to know, though, how do you see tariffs? Do you see it, whether it's presidential power or congressional power, do you see it as a benefit to the country? Is it a detriment to the country? And again, being a professor of finance, this is obviously right up your alley, just looking at it in that perspective, not even necessarily just the political side.
Yeah, as the author of my first book, uh, Tax Free 2000, where I called for the abolition of all taxes. Tariff is a tax, so therefore I'm not in favor of a tariff, especially one that the president has unilaterally imposed on the American people. And so I hope the Supreme Court rules 9-0 that the president doesn't have the unilateral authority to impose tariffs, because he wasn't given that power by the Congress. He was given power to, quote, regulate trade under emergency circumstances. There's no emergency going on in the trade issue. This is the canard that members of the federal government do. Administrations from either side of the aisle, they always use the concept of an emergency to impose some draconian measures on the American people, like Nixon did in 1971 with wage price controls, where he said there's a major problem in the country. We have to impose wage price controls and sever the last link between the dollar and gold. I'm not in favor of these government emergencies because they usually because of a political agenda that the president has. And so hopefully the tariffs will go away. President has already backtracked on tariffs because he knows that people are getting hurt by them, and they never should have been imposed in the first place. And I'm going to say something that, Jennifer, that you probably have never heard before. The federal government is not responsible for the health of the economy. The health of the economy is dependent upon men and women entrepreneurs and investment, making sure that they produce the goods and services that people want. All the government should do is get out of the way of the men and women entrepreneurs who built this country. It wasn't the government that built this country. It was the men and women entrepreneurs. I have a wonderful book on my bookshelf in the back of me. It's entitled "They Made America." It was published 20 years ago, and it describes in little biographical sketches the men and women entrepreneurs who built America. There were no politicians there. It's all about people who were creative, inventive, innovative, who produced the products that the people want and made our lives better.
So it's basically the laissez-faire, let them do whatever it is that they want to do.
As long as it's peaceful, this is the important point. As long as there's no fraud involved, as long as there are high standards for safety and quality. And again, it's very hard to be successful in business if you're poisoning your customers, if you're providing shoddy products to your customers. In the age of the internet, bad news travels fast on the internet. So with competition, you have so many choices to choose from between automobiles and cell phones and streaming services and clothing and food. This is the wonderful thing about a free market economy, free enterprise economy, is that there's consumer choice, and entrepreneurs have to cater to consumers. People think that entrepreneurs are so powerful. Well, that's not true, because the bankruptcies have been happening throughout American history because entrepreneurs were not able to satisfy consumer needs.
Right. So I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this next question, but I'm going to ask it. The central bank, the Federal
Yeah.
Reserve, do you believe the central bank should, or the Federal Reserve should be involved in setting monetary policy and watching inflation, things along those lines? Or do you believe that that also should be left a little bit looser in the process?
Well, the Federal Reserve is the engine of inflation. I write about that in my book called Why the Federal Reserve Sucks. It causes inflation, recessions, bubbles, and enriches the 1%. There's a vast literature on this subject going back 200 years, how destabilizing central banking is. And I write about it on my Substack. Central banking manipulates interest rates, and that's not the function of a central bank. The function of the central bank is to maintain the integrity of the currency, and that was the initial charge of the Federal Reserve in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. They've done a miserable job because the purchasing power of the dollar is down by 98% or so since 1913. It takes a load of dollars to buy stuff that years ago took a lot less, and so the Federal Reserve causes inflation. It manipulates interest rates, which causes an artificial boom. Then it leads to a bust, and it enriches the 1% because they're the main beneficiaries of so-called quantitative easy money policies.
So here's the other flip side. You have countries like China that manipulate
Yeah.
their currency. And they manipulate it for the benefit of their country to the detriment of everyone else. Would you favor something more like that, or is that also something that has a different regard?
Well, in a pure free market economy, government would be out of the money sphere, and everyone would be using gold coins, silver coins, or substitutes, which where would be claims to gold and silver in the warehouses known as banks. That's what a free market banking system, monetary system would look like. Is that the government would get out of the monetary arena completely, and people would use whatever they chose, which is how gold and silver emerged as the premier mediums of exchange over the centuries. And once the central banking got started in England in 1694, then it was just a matter of time before banks realized, and the bankers realized, they can continue their flawed banking policy of borrowing short and lending long, which is a recipe for disaster. And so the Federal Reserve was created to backstop the banks because the banks were going bankrupt throughout the 19th century with these banking panics because they borrowed money they didn't have in reserve. And when people got a wind of it, they ran on the bank, and that's how they ruptured the bank, hence the term bankrupt. So again, the history is pretty clear, Jennifer. Central banking is a destabilizing force in the economy. It weakens economic activity. We would have more prosperity if we didn't have an institution that debased the currency, manipulated interest rates.
So let's talk about cryptocurrency,
Yeah,
because crypto is very different from fiat, which is the typical currency that we all know in our hands.
right.
Would you favor more of a crypto kind of economy in that regard? Because crypto, again, it's decentralized, it's deregulated, or not regulated, not even deregulated. But how would you look at crypto in that regard to the overall economic policy of the world, not just the United States?
Well, critics of crypto have called it a nothing burger because there's nothing there. At least the dollar legally is defined as 1/42nd of an ounce of gold. A crypto is basically what people are willing to pay for a token, a digitized token in the blockchain or the exchange where crypto is traded. So it doesn't meet the test of a money, which has to emerge from the market, and it has to be a tangible item. That is really one of the great lessons of monetary economics, is that money has to emerge from the marketplace as a commodity, as gold, silver, copper, and other things emerged over the years. And therefore, crypto doesn't meet that criteria of something that is tangible that can meet people's needs. And we see crypto, it was $120,000 in 2025. It went down to 90,000 at the end of 2025. And who knows where it's going? Some people think it's going to a half a million or $1 million, which is great if you own some and you've held on to it, but it doesn't meet the criteria of what money historically has been in human civilization.
Okay, so let's move on from currency and let's talk about something that was created earlier in the 20th century, which is looking at the entitlements. Social
Mm,
Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, things along those lines.
yeah,
Again, when it originally came out, there was a specific reason that FDR needed to push through these policies in the New Deal. So I'm curious to know, obviously, if you look at the Constitution and the bureaucratic state that has since erupted since the founding is very, very different. You mentioned earlier the Libertarian platform is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, does not include the bureaucratic state that we are in today. I'm curious to know, though, when you look at those entitlements, how do you see those? And do they still serve a purpose? Do you think that the founding fathers would have supported? Or do you think that it is such a um, gross disfigurement of
mm,
what they originally imagined for our country? And again, keep, not counting the fact that they looked at black people as three-fifths of a person and all of
right.
that, completely separating out those beliefs, which today, obviously, I think all of us can agree are completely out of touch with reality. But I'm curious to know, though, as it relates to the financial side of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and other entitlements?
Yeah, all we have to do is go look at Article 1, Section 8, which outlines the authorized spending of the federal government. And there's nothing in Article 1, Section 8 that talks about retirement benefits, medical benefits, or anything that the government does in these entitlement programs. And if we had an honest government, which some people think is an oxymoron, and if the American people were honest with themselves and the government, when the prohibitionists wanted to ban alcohol, they knew they couldn't pass a law because there was no authorization by the Constitution. So we got the 18th Amendment. When the income tax was ruled unconstitutional, the proponents of the income tax amended the Constitution to have a direct income tax on the American people. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives the power of the government to create retirement benefits or health care benefits at all. And so I consider them another example of how government encroachment on the free market, on individual responsibility, self-governing, has taken over the American society, where tens of millions of people are now dependent upon retirement benefits, healthcare benefits. And that's what the debate is. Not the debate. The fight is over how much we're going to spend each year on these programs, as opposed to having a debate on whether we should have these programs. And that's why I wrote an article in 2025 toward financial independence and a constitutional federal budget, which was published at the Mises Institute, which describes the transition from where we are today to a constitutional federal budget where people would be responsible for their own life. That's really what it comes down to. Who's responsible for an adult's life? And I grew up in an era where I saw my father work. He provided for his family. He didn't look for any entitlements. And that's my worldview as a youngster. And when I became older and realized that where we're headed with the New Deal and Great Society program means could mean a national financial crisis comparable to 1929. And I think that's where we're headed, because the federal government can't keep on spending money that it doesn't have. And medical care is certainly not the responsibility of the federal government. It's a doctor-patient relationship. That's why I wrote that book on how we can have universal medical care without the government, and it would be based upon the doctor-patient relationship. And I talk about how we can fund that uh, based upon free market principles, which would give us lower cost and better quality health care. We're now spending $5 trillion a year on medical care, and the outcomes are one of the worst in the world because we're spending so much on things that we don't need insurance for. That's the other thing. We're overinsured, over medicated, and we have too many chronic health conditions in the country. And that's really what's driving healthcare costs. Another reason we have huge healthcare costs, I think it's 40%, I don't know the exact number, of Medicare, I think, is for the last year of life. So we really need to have a fundamental debate in this country as to how much we're going to spend on people's end of life care, because it's eating up scarce resources. And what we know from economics is resources are scarce. So if we keep on doing what we're doing, we're eventually going to run out of money. And then the Federal Reserve is probably going to step in, print up a lot of money to pay the bills, and then we're off to the races with hyperinflation.
So I want to ask you a different question because education is
Yeah,
also not part of the US Constitution, right?
right.
We have since come to understanding that the federal government does have a requirement to still focus on education. Equal protection has applied also to education rights in this country. But how, in your perspective, would you view education? Because obviously it isn't just a state issue, because the federal government under Bush Jr. came out with the No Child Left Behind, Common
Right,
Core, things along those lines. There's been a
right.
lot of attempts to change how that even looks in this country. But I'm curious to know, though, where do you sit as it relates to education? Because again, education is a significant portion of the budget too. We know that Trump and his second administration has been attempting to limit the federal involvement in the education department as well. And again, having them manage the different student loan programs for
Yeah.
colleges, that again comes through the federal government, not the states. How do you look at that as it relates to where we are as well?
It's very simple, Jennifer. If you look at the cost of education, and healthcare and housing. What do those three areas of the economy have in common? Heavily government subsidies, increasing demand, and getting very poor outcomes. And so Reagan was right. He campaigned getting rid of the Department of Education in 1980. Here it is 45, 46 years later. We still have the Department of Education. So I would scrap the Department of Education. Local school boards can raise the money that they need in order to fund education. But I think what we're seeing in this country is that parents are fed up with a lot of things that are going on in school. That's why homeschooling is increasing by the fastest rate in American history. And education is really the purview of parents. They're the ones that initially educate children from the time they're infants to the time they get to kindergarten. So I would scrap the Department of Education and leave it into the hands of parents. There are private institutions online where kids can get a great education without government involvement.
So let me ask, in the idea of charter schools, where the government, and again, I know what you just said, but in terms of charter schools, where the government may be, right now it's paying into the public school system. But for a charter school, where the government would be using the same tax dollars to send your
Yeah.
child to a private school instead of a public school, or at a certain level of whatever percent of the tuition bill, based on whatever the normal ratio would be. How do you see that? Is there still any validity in that, or is that completely, in your perspective, off the beaten path as well?
Well, again, if the perspective that I have is a free society necessitates government not getting involved in things that are the purview of the individual and the family or the community from a voluntary basis, then the government should not be involved in these things. Having said that, charter schools have some merit at the local level if there are enough parents who like that. But the problem is, and here's the point I'm going to make, the most discriminated people in America are single individuals and childless couples because they're paying the taxes at the local level for other families' children. And that's another example of the redistribution of income and wealth in this country. And so redistribution of income and wealth is another fancy word for saying taking money from Peter and giving it to Paul. Taking is something that is frowned upon in the libertarian worldview because it's coercion. And so we should get to a society where coercion is not part of the means to achieve a good end, whether it's education, housing, or other things. Things that have good ends should have good means, and those good means should be voluntary, non coercive ways of achieving those goals.
Thank you. So, Murray, we're unfortunately running close to time. I'm curious to know, though, because I would be very remiss if we didn't at least comment on the fact it's our 250th year as a country. I mentioned in
Right.
the introduction. 250 years ago, a bunch of men decided to come together and they had this wacky idea called democracy. There were a couple of ideas about what democracy would be like from the ancient Greek philosophers, you know, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, but we really didn't have what democracy would be like. And in truth, the United States is not a democracy, it's a republic, right? You even hear it in the Pledge of Allegiance. We pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands,
Right.
right? We're a republic, we're not a democratic nation in that regard. And again, there's a lot of differences between what a pure democracy and a republic is. But again, I'm looking right now, though, if Murray, we look at the next 250 years, right? We've seen what the past 250 years has done to this country. There's so much that has changed, again, since 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was first signed, and the 13 colonies became the 13 first states of these United States. In your perspective, how do you think we've done? Obviously, we heard a lot, already, in terms of we've been going far away from what the founders originally envisioned. But where do you think, if you're looking out, and again, the next 250 years with AI and the advancements with everything can be rapidly different. but do you think our nation is going to be slipping a lot more? Is it going to be moving in a different positive direction? How do you think we're going to be making all of that happen?
Well, if we continue on the road that we're on, Jennifer, I think the United States of America will split up into several countries over the next 30, 40, 50 years because there's too much tension to keep the country together based upon different values all across the country. And having said that, to me, I'm an optimist. I think enough people who understand what the Declaration means life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. To me, that is the essence of a free society, of voluntary exchange, of free enterprise, of civil liberties, all the things that will make life worth living, that will give us sustainable prosperity. Unfortunately, the political elites, the financial elites have figured out that they can use the government for their own personal benefit. That's not what the founders envisioned from my reading of it. There were some founders that wanted to have more of an aristocratic, top-down approach to governing. But Jefferson and others who felt that decentralization was the key, that limited government was important to maintain unity in this country. And I think if we start having these discussions as we go into the second 250 years of America's existence, we should have these honest and civil debates about what does it mean to have an America. And if we have that debate, I'd like to participate in it because I've been studying this issue for more than 50 years, and I've been writing about it for over 30 years in books and in other venues for about 50 years as well. And so I'm confident that if enough people realize that we cannot continue the road that we're on, then we will realize that we have to get back to the basic principles of the Declaration, which I think is one of the most important documents in the history of the human race.
Thank you. So, one more question as it relates to civil liberties, because you mentioned as part of the pursuit of happiness that that is included there. So, in the movie The American President, Michael Douglas as president challenged his competitor because there was a thing made that he was a card carrying member of the ACLU, the Americans for Civil Liberties Union. I'm curious to know, with the civil liberties that you are supporting in the idea of pursuit of happiness, would you say the ACLU still is in the same direction as what it is that you're looking at from the pursuit of happiness? Are they way too liberal? Are they too reserved in what they're doing? I'm curious to know how that might fit in. And again, this is not meant as a, I gotcha kind of question. It's just,
Sure.
I'm curious to know. And ACLU, please just understand where this is coming from.
Yeah, I think the ACLU has a mixed track record in recent years because, in some ways, they've supported more government power over individuals and communities. And one of their great moments, I think, was when they defended the right of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, a Jewish neighborhood. And a lot of people left them because they were supporting the First Amendment, even though it was not very pretty in that support. So the ACLU needs to get back to its original mission, which is individual rights. There's no such thing as group rights. There are only individual rights. That's what the Declaration talks about. And so I think we have to discuss this notion of individual rights, property rights, which is sacrosanct. It should be in America that your property is an extension of you, and if you attack private property, you're attacking the individual, and therefore you no longer have a free society. You have some form of a autocracy or a tyranny, and so we have to work constantly to remind the people in power that they have a very limited role in our society, and the ACLU should be standing foursquare for the individual and not sort of any sort of group rights, because groups don't have rights. There are only individual rights.
Thank you. So, Murray, people have been listening to our conversation for the last 40 or so minutes, and they're interested in getting in touch with you. How can they reach out?
Well, there are two websites. It's murraysabrin.substack.com, where I write commentary on current events, economic, political, social events. Also, my new initiative, that's why I'm wearing the hat, MAFI, Make Americans Financially Independent. And the website is mafiusa.com, where I discuss why I've done this initiative to get people to wear the hat so they can express themselves as wanting to have a free society of financial independence as opposed to a dependent society where they have to grovel in front of the federal government to get the necessities of life. And I think once we have this discussion around the United States, people can develop MAFI chapters all over the country. And I'll have a reading list online where people can read some of the penetrating literature that says why we should have a financially independent society.
Thank you. And again, we'll have all the information in the description below so that you can reach out on Murray's Substack, as well as his other website and the MAFI MAFI program that Murray was just mentioning. As we look, though, at the next 250 years of what this country may or may not be, there's so much that may be there that we can still say America can continue to be that shining city on the hill. But it's really going to come down to what we all do as we continue to look forward. Do we allow the divisiveness that we've been seeing in our nation over the last several years to really continue and not only take hold, but continue to grow? Or are we going to try and remember the days after 9/11 when you walk down any street practically in the United States and you saw flags hanging outside all of those homes? You saw how the United States came together. In the beginning of the COVID pandemic in 2020, much of the United States, again, came together. We weren't yet blaming specific groups. We weren't yet arguing, oh, you're for masking, you're not for masking, you're for a vaccine, you're not for a vaccine. It was, we need to get through this. If you think about at 7 o'clock here, especially in the New York City area, we saw at 7 o'clock every single night, people were going out onto their terraces and saluting our healthcare heroes that were fighting the COVID pandemic. Again, we were coming together for a common cause to defeat COVID. Or we can go and we can say, as Maria was saying, in the next 30 to 50 years, this country may be split into multiple smaller nations because we have this infighting that has been allowed to take root. We need to really see exactly where that's going and how we can find ways that we can come together. But it's up to you and me to be doing that, because if we leave it to everyone else, it will not happen. We all need to do it. There's something called grassroots activities. It starts with you, it starts with me, and it starts with Murray. As each of us are going through that process, there's so much that we can be doing, and I look forward to seeing where all of that goes. Murray, I want to thank you so much for being my guest on the show today.
Oh, thanks, Jennifer, for the invitation. And it was a great discussion. And hopefully people will go to the website and join the MAFI movement.
Absolutely. And again, we'll have all that information in the descriptions that you can connect and consider joining the MAFI movement. On that note, this has been another episode of MOJO, the Meaning of Life and Business. And until next time, here is to your success. This has been another episode of MOJO, the Meaning of Life and Business podcast. If you like what you heard, please consider leaving us a review, liking us, or reaching out to us. You can contact us at bgsicoaching.com and let us know what you think. Thanks so much again for listening.